How come slavery was such a big deal in ancient Greece, where people cared about being free? It might seem strange, but maybe it's not so weird after all. Maybe it's because they had slavery that they started to really appreciate freedom. Here are 10 facts about slavery in ancient Greece that might surprise you. Number 10 is slave population. We don't have exact numbers on how many slaves lived in ancient Greece. Some smart people have tried to guess, but it changed a lot depending on where you were in Greece. Nowadays, experts think that in a place called Attica, which included Athens, there were maybe 100,000 slaves from 450 to 320 BC. The total population there was around 250,000, so about 2 out of every 5 people were slaves. Other guesses say that in different parts of ancient Greece, somewhere between 15 to 40% of the people were slaves at different times. Number 9 is slave procurement. Many of the slaves in ancient Greece were captured during wars. When an army won a battle, they often took people from the defeated side as slaves. For instance, Alexander the Great's father, Philip II, sold 20,000 women and children into slavery after a battle in 339 BC. Sometimes, slave traders would even follow armies to buy prisoners right after they were captured. Other ways of getting slaves included piracy, people owing money, and some tribes trading their own members for goods. There were also places called trading posts where people could buy and sell slaves, with some big ones located around the Black Sea and in cities like Byzantium and Ephesus. Number 8 is slave occupations. In Athens, people didn't really like the idea of working for others and getting paid for it. The only job that was okay was working for the government. Since most free people didn't want to do regular jobs, they used slaves instead. So, slaves did all sorts of work in ancient Greece. They cooked, built things, cleaned, mined, nursed, carried stuff, and sometimes even fought in wars. Some slaves even held important jobs, like being police officers in Athens, especially in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, when a lot of them were from Scythia. Number 7 is slave ownership. Lots of people in ancient Greece owned slaves. A regular family might have had somewhere between 3 and 12 slaves, but it's hard to be sure because it changed depending on where and when you were. In a play called Ecclesiazousi, Aristophanes said that not having any slaves meant you were poor. The main slave owners were the government, who used them as police and for other jobs, and rich business people, who had slaves working in mines. Number 6 is versatile lifestyles. In ancient Greece, there were different kinds of slaves, and how they lived and what they could expect depended on what they did. The worst off were the ones who worked in mines. Their lives were really hard, and they probably didn't live very long. But not all slaves had terrible lives. Some had jobs like craftsmen and could live separately from their masters. They could even make money by selling things, although they had to give some of it to their masters. In Sparta, slaves called Helots could have families. In Athens, slaves who fought in the army and died in battle were honored with a special funeral, just like free citizens. So, while many slaves had tough lives, some had it a bit better. Number 5 is slaves and craft production. In ancient Athens, craft workshops started becoming big factories during classical times. These factories were mostly owned by rich politicians and relied heavily on slave labor. For example, Demosthenes owned 2 factories. One made swords and had around 30 slaves working there. The other made couches and had about 20 slaves. Another famous writer, Lysias, had the biggest factory we know about. His shield factory employed a whopping 120 slaves. Number 4 is slaves and mining. Mining was a big deal in ancient Greece, just like it is today. But it was super risky, so the Athenians used slaves to do it. People made a ton of money not just from mining, but also from selling slaves to work in the mines. For example, a guy named Nicias made a huge profit by supplying around 1,000 slaves to work in the mines. He made about 10 talents a year, which was like a 33% return on his investment. Working in the mines was really tough for slaves. They had to work underground in chains, with no sunlight or fresh air. In 413 BC, a bunch of Athenian soldiers got captured during a battle in Sicily and were forced to work in quarries. None of them made it out alive. Number 3 is slaves and freedom. Some slaves had a chance to become free. This mostly happened if they could save up money, especially if they had jobs where they earned wages and could manage their finances. If a slave saved enough money, they could buy their freedom by paying their masters a set amount. Some slaves in the army were also freed as a reward for their service. In Delphi, there are writings on stone that show the names of slaves who bought their freedom. These writings reveal that slaves came from all over, like Caria, Egypt, Lydia, Phoenicia, Syria, and other places. Number 2 is Helots. The Helots were Greeks who were made slaves by the Spartans. It's not clear where they originally came from, but some stories say they were from a place called Helos, which the Spartans took over. As the Spartans conquered more places, the number of Helots grew. Helots did all kinds of jobs like farming and serving in houses, basically anything that kept the Spartan citizens from having to do it themselves. But life for Helots was tough. They were treated badly, made to wear humiliating clothes, and had to endure beatings every year, even if they hadn't done anything wrong, just to remind them they were slaves. Sparta had a secret police called the Cryptiae, whose job was to control the Helots. They would kill any Helots they found out in the countryside at night, and during the day, they'd kill any Helots who seemed strong and healthy. Number 1 is rational justifications. Ancient Greek society didn't see slavery the way we do today. They thought it was normal and even had reasons to support it. For example, Aristotle, a famous philosopher, said that some people were just meant to be slaves, while others were meant to be their masters. He called this idea natural slavery. Aristotle thought that slavery was good for slaves because, without masters, they wouldn't know how to live. He saw slaves as basic tools that belonged to their masters, with no rights except what their masters gave them.